might as well just get into
Right.
into the 7 stages of civilization, right?
Right, because we just explained different examples of how this instrument of expansion can become institutionalized, but then how we can reform that again. What does that mean in the context of the 7 stages of civilization?
Right. So, the 7 stages of civilization. This shit's so cool. I still get goosebumps when I think about this stuff and talk about this stuff and read about this stuff. So, Quigley spent some time in the book criticizing some other. I mean, not like, oh, you're an idiot, but just saying, hey, other historians who have attempted to describe the life cycle of a civilization have always seemed to have fallen short. And I think, and again talking for Quigley, that I have figured out at least a good starting point for describing the life cycle of civilizations that can help us understand where we're at, so we can and understand where we're going, so we can do something about it. So there's 7 stages. 7. Mixture, gestation, expansion, conflict, universal empire, decay, and invasion. Nima, let's go right into it. Mixture. So,
Yeah.
Did you want to take it, or do you want me to?
Well,
go?
mixture happens when previous civilizations fall apart and disparate groups of people come together and start forming some sort of coherent unit. It doesn't even have to be a civilization yet at that point, because there's no instrument of expansion yet. It's a very turbulent and crazy time. You could say, for example, the collapse of classical civilization, the collapse of the Roman Empire would be an example of where, the different, I don't know what you call them, tribes or protectorates or monarchies of Europe were basically suddenly left alone, left without a ruler. And so they came together and sometimes worked together, sometimes worked against each other. But this was the first beginnings of the Western civilization, basically. And that's what I believe, that's how he describes the stage of mixture.
And then I would even go to say, you mentioned that it's at the when a civilization dies on the periphery, you usually see this new one born. That's usually where it is, but it doesn't need to be that. So it's any time you get 2 societies that come together that are equal. And when I mean equal is I mean that they're willing to intermarry, as opposed to one enslaves the other, and that's the end of the story. If they're able to intermarry, you have the situation where, okay, what rituals are we going to follow, and how are we going to raise the kids? Because I got culture A telling me this, and I got culture B telling me that. Which one's it going to be? How's it going to look? When this happens, obviously the culture has the opportunity to change. If that culture changes, and it usually doesn't do this, if that culture changes in a way that it develops an instrument of expansion, we're off to the races. The fringes of dead civilizations are great places for new civilizations to pop up. And in fact, Western civilization is not the only child of classical civilization. Western, Russian, and Islamic civilization are all children of Rome, so to speak. So once we pass the age of mixture, these 2 peoples coming together, and I guess maybe if we literally just look at it, this is the time when the 2 peoples are actually, getting into contact with each other, right? Gestation is the time, Quigley points out, which nothing seems to be happening. The people have mixed and they're just coexisting for a while, right? However, the instrument of expansion is starting to get set up, which leads us into stage 3, which is, unfortunately, stage 4 is the most exciting one to talk about, which is the age of conflict. But the age of expansion should be the most exciting thing, because that's when the cool stuff is happening, and everybody's getting wealthier and getting better off. So the age of expansion is marked once, obviously, this instrument of expansion is up and running. 4 specific things typically happen. 1, increased production of goods and a rise in the standard of living. An increased population, mostly due to a declining death rate. Increased geographic extent. Obviously, we're expanding where we live, mostly from exploration and colonization. And an increase in knowledge. Now, these four things work with each other in such a way that enough resources are produced to create leisure time in a small part of the population so they can dedicate to art and exploration and philosophy and religion and writing and all these sort of things that we learned from high school history class, right? Or social studies class for us who went to school in the United States. I don't know what they called it in Germany, but it was pretty lame here. So,
well, we had Geschichte, politische Weltkunde, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that sounds a lot better than social studies. So, often expansion. This is interesting. Is a period of one. Is often expansion period is one of democracy, scientific advance, revolutionary political change, in order to adapt from a static to an expansive mode of life. That totally makes sense. And then, as a result of the expansion, the civilization gets divided into two pieces. We've got the core and we've got the periphery. So, the core is where the civilization had occupied at the end of stage 2. The periphery is the civilization that's been expanded to once stage 3 happens. And an example of this, the core of classical civilization was Greece. And then the periphery ended up being like the whole Mediterranean basin and halfway up to Europe and over into Saudi Arabia and all that sort of stuff, right? Western civilization, the original core would be North Italy, France, and England. And he says here, extreme West Germany. And obviously the periphery now is like America and Australia and New Zealand and stuff like that. So while the periphery is expanding, the instrument of expansion in the core begins to become institutionalized. This ends up being a key point. So instrument of expansion still working in the periphery. It's starting to get institutionalized in the core. I think just thinking about the difference between Europe and its peripheries, like the United States, is just a perfect example of this, right? And the periphery continues to expand and often shortcuts many of the developments that the core went through. So, I mean, they get to inherit writing and they get to inherit all this stuff that took centuries for the core to develop. The result is
more dynamic. They're more dynamic. They have fewer institutionalized structures, so they can grow faster at the end of the day. They can actually be more dynamic than the core, which they inherited.
And they typically tend to be more materialistic and less legalistic.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So eventually what happens is that as the instrument of expansion starts to slow down,
as we just described how that happens earlier,
that's when we start to enter the age of conflict. So, and again, this isn't that the actual savings is decreasing. What we're saying is that the speed of expansion has begun to decrease. So, for calculus nerds out there, I'm saying that the second derivative starts to get lower.
Mm-hmm.
For non-calculus nerds out there, I'm sorry I said that. So the age of conflict, which is where things get spicy. So, to quote Quigley, this is probably the most complex, most interesting, and most critical of all the 7 stages. Now, there's 4 chief characteristics with this, just like there were with the age of expansion. We have a declining rate of expansion, like I just said, growing tension of evolution, and increasing class conflicts. And I remember the tension of evolution was the vested interests controlling the resources, fighting against the mass population that wants access to the resources like they used to have when the instrument of expansion was working. Increasingly frequent and violent imperialist wars. Is any of this starting to sound familiar? And growing irrationality, pessimism, superstitions, and otherworldliness amongst the populations. So, when the instrument of expansion starts to become this institution, and this tension starts to increase, typically, this is usually between a minority and a majority, where the minority is this vested interest. But neither side typically, and I would say with an asterisk, I think there's one side that knows what's going on today, but neither side typically knows what the problem is, right? In classical civilization, there wasn't someone going, well, the slavery is our instrument of expansion, which is allowing us to do this. And if we stop that and we spend it on this, and these people are going to suffer, and if these people suffer, it's going to create these class conflicts. And nobody's thinking about that back then, right?
Cool story, bro. Is what they're going to say. They're going to say,
right? No, they're not aware of this, and so they start lashing out in ways that are not very effective. So one of the things that we mentioned before, programs for sharing surplus amongst the masses are worse than useless. Again, this is the stimulus check or the welfare check or whatever. It doesn't fix or replace the instrument of expansion, and you just destroyed a bunch of surplus that could have been used for investment. So much for the argument of the welfare state. And he mentions this, and we talked about this earlier, is that if the instrument of expansion if a new instrument of expansion can come into existence, it's usually through circumvention and not through reform. So this is also a theme throughout this book, is that circumvention is a lot easier to pull off than reform. Again, thinking about the news and the media is what's going through my head. So with the imperialist wars and the irrationality, different classes, the minority and majority classes engage in this for two different reasons. Participation in the war for the masses is often the only way to get a job once the instrument of expansion stops working. And I mean, this goes back to what I was mentioning before, is that when the instrument of expansion is working, you are rewarded for participating in society. To put this in the 50s nuclear family sense, if you go to school, get good grades, get a job, get married, and buy a house, you can do all that if you go to school and get good grades. That's not the case anymore. You in modern day, you don't get rewarded for participating in what society tells you to participate in the same way that you did, say, 70 years ago. I got this note in here. I wrote this before. That I read an article sometime before I wrote these notes about the military complaining that a recent boost in the economy had resulted in fewer recruits. You think? Yeah, tough. So now the masses then turn to irrationality to compensate for the insecurity of life. And now this is where this should really strike home. What are examples of irrationality? It can come in forms such as narcotics, gambling, obsession with sex, often in the forms of perversion, growing numbers of neurotics and psychotics, and growing obsession with the death and hereafter. Did I just describe the social justice warrior phenomenon or not?
Also, it's what E. Michael Jones said in a recent interview, where he said, well, for some reason, sodomy and slavery always end up going hand in hand.
Oh yeah, and
right?
I think I mentioned it. I didn't say it. I didn't say why. Yeah,
usury and sodomy. Yeah.
I said I think I know the answer to that, but we don't have time to talk about it during that show. Well, we're talking about it now, right? So why do they turn to narcotics? Why do they turn to gambling? Why do they turn to perversions of sex? And then, I mean, let's talk about perversions of sex too. I mean, it's not just sodomy. We see this gender haywire gobbledygook of it's not, it used to be, hey, it's okay if you're gay. That was the first hurdle to come over, right? Now it's glorious if you're gay. It's glorious if you're transsexual. It's glorious if you can remember everybody's constantly changing pronouns.
Stunning and brave.
It's stunning and brave.
It's sassy too.
And the argument that Quigley's making here is that the instrument of expansion has institutionalized, so the masses no longer are able to get rewarded for participating in what society tells them to participate in, right? Because, I mean, all the people doing this, if all these drugs or whatever, they say, well, yeah, I went to school. Yeah, I got good grades. I didn't do anything. Right?
There's a lack of purpose, right?
There's a lack of purpose.
People.
Yes. So that's what the masses do. Because remember, we were talking about the masses react badly and the vested interests react badly. What do the vested interests do? So they create wars and irrationality to serve to divert the masses from themselves being the vested interests, to and the uninvested surplus, right? We got too many people without jobs, send them to war and let them die, right? Oh, distract them with bread and circuses, or heroin and Suboxone, or stimulus checks.
Or run biochemical pharmaceutical mass experiments on them.
So the vested interests create the wars, to create the irrationality, and to ensure division. The vested interests create instruments of imperialist wars, instruments of class oppression, and instruments of irrationality. Nima, can you think of an instrument of class oppression?
Vaccine mandates.
Anything else?
Austerity.
What about identity politics?
Sure. Anti-whiteness.
I'm thinking of BLM and Antifa destroying during the Summer of Love in 2020. Just
any form of race obsession will lead you to that point.
So the vested interests create the problems that we just described for the masses. And then Quigley points out that once these three new instruments, so we've got the instrument of imperialist war, we've got the instrument of class oppression, and these should be instruments of imperialist war, instruments of class oppression, and instruments of irrationality. Once these instruments become institutionalized, then it's pretty much over for that civilization. Let's give some. I do want to give some historical examples that I have here. Just when we start getting into the modern situation, it's easy to lose sight of what's going on because you're in the mix of it. So here's a couple examples of the instrument of expansion becoming institutionalized in other civilizations. In Mesopotamian civilization, the Sumerian priests fall behind the secular kings that they had set up to command their armies. Good example. In classical civilization, slave-owning landlords, the original instrument of expansion, were eclipsed by mercenary armies that were formed to carry on imperialist wars. Example number 3. The Nazi Party, originally financed by German monopoly capitalists, took over these capitalists for their own ends. Concise, good examples. So now, as a result...
And the other examples of what we just said earlier, for example, investment banks got eclipsed by monopoly capitalists in the United States.
Yep.
And the cartels became a major institution.
So, as a result of all the imperialist wars, the number of political units gets reduced, and what typically happens is one emerges triumphant over the entire civilization. Rome over classical civilization is a perfect example of this, and in fact, I've got this this handy-dandy list. Persia and Mesopotamian civilization. The Aztecs over Mesoamerican civilization, the Incas over Andean civilizations, the Manchu over China, the Mughals over Hindu civilization, the Ottomans over Islamic civilization. And in the 3 phases that we discussed about with Western civilization, first phase was Henry V. Second phase was, and these were attempts, these guys weren't successful. First phase was Henry V of England. Second was Napoleon from France, duh. And third attempt was Hitler of Nazi Germany. And all 3 of these failed, and we had in the West we have circumvented them and moved on. But again, we don't want to go back into that. We're going to talk about universal empire now. So the obvious question arises here: why do excuse me, I didn't even mention this. A political unit manages to be triumphant and conquers a whole civilization, and that political unit usually comes from the periphery. Why would that come from the periphery?
Because the periphery is wealthier, more powerful, more dynamic, and for that reason has the ability to build better weaponry and better systems of domination.
And they're typically more materialistic, as I mentioned before. Quigley points out that, I mean, at least in the old days, I don't know how much stuff like the internet and telephones changes this, but it used to be stuff moved faster than ideas, right? The economic goods could move faster than, say, teaching people writing, right? So the people on the periphery, they're simultaneously not bogged down by the increasing legalism and institutionalization within the core, and they have the goods to create the better military. So, and which is another way of saying that the core leaves stage 3 expansion and goes into conflict before the periphery does.
Yeah, this is another thing to just point out by the by. These are not distinct phases, right? These
Right.
are oftentimes
very
overlaps
blurred.
in between the two.
Well, very blurred, and you also have to look at it from, like, it's not, you have to look at it from a geographical standpoint. It's not like the same things happening over the entire geography all at the same time, right? This is really blurred. And I think it's worth bringing up the example that, or the metaphor that Quigley brings up at the beginning of the book, which is that when he was a kid, when he would walk, I think, to school, there was this place that he would walk by that had a bunch of quartz crystals lying on the ground. And he had read about quartz crystals in his book, and in his book, it showed this very perfectly shaped quartz crystal. And he said, no matter how hard I looked, I could never find this perfectly shaped quartz crystal and all these quartz crystals lying on the ground. They were all either somehow disfigured or growing into each other or something to that effect. And it's not that quartz crystals don't grow the way that they explained in the book. It's just that they don't always do it so perfectly, right? And that, for example, you can have a quartz crystal that's kind of a ball where you got the crystal sticking out, where you could say, well, okay, I'm not entirely sure where this one stops and that one begins, but there's definitely two distinct crystal, shapes coming out of this ball of quartz crystal. So in the same way, and anything that we're talking about here, and this is why we talked about like gradients at the beginning of abstraction when we had the sixfold division of culture, is that this is all in the gradient, and this is all saying, okay, I see distinct things that get muddied at some point, right? So if you got a specific example of like, oh no, but this happened in Rome while this was happening over in France, and that disproves the point. It's like, no, we know things happen at different speeds, and they're not happening.
And also, for example, one very pertinent example I would think of is we have the U.S. with their troops and their military bases all over the world that clearly looks like a symptom of universal empire, but it doesn't mean we're in the universal empire phase yet necessarily. It's just that during the conflict phase, the basis is established for a potential universal empire down the road. It doesn't have to.
Right. Also, Quigley points out that there are some examples of civilizations that had a universal empire from the beginning. Russian, Egyptian, and Minoan are civilizations that were always ruled by a single political unit, and he points out that these civilizations tend to be more socialistic. And I think by that he means that the central political unit controls the resources and hands them out as they deem.
It means that the instrument of expansion is the state, to be specific. Because I've read that in Quigley, and he said that specifically.
Okay.
That's what he means by socialistic.
So, the first thing that happens when you get universal empire is a golden age. The first and obvious reason why this gets called the golden age is that the wars stop. Right? One political unit conquers the whole thing, the wars stop. You get a standard money, you get standard units of measure, and I think not that the Mongols were a universal empire, because they didn't last very long, but the Mongols do provide a interesting example of this, which is that even though they killed like 90% of everybody, the people that were still alive did enjoy relatively stable law, and they could travel very easily, and you could trade within a much greater empire because there wasn't warring political units that would stop you, right? You get this idea that things have gotten better, and in some sense they have, which is why we might call them a golden age, but in reality, the instrument of expansion still has not been addressed. And so they're still experiencing decreasing rate of expansion, growing class conflicts, declining democracy, dying science, decreasing inventiveness, and growing irrationality. And once this happens, you start sliding into the age of decay. So, the age of decay, this is a period of acute economic depression, declining standard of living, civil wars between vested interests. He didn't explain this that much, but I think that's a really good point to put out. I guess this is where like CNN and NBC get in a like a street fight or something. Where
oh, that'd be awesome.
That would be awesome. But
Bum Fights 2.0.
And we also see growing illiteracy. I mean, this is if the Roman Empire or classical civilization, I think is a good example of this, where any standard historian will point out that in the tail end of the Roman Empire, cities are getting emptied. Nobody cares about the classical ideal anymore. People aren't worshiping the gods anymore. Nobody's making the sacrifices. People aren't donating their, saying, I want to be recognized in the community. No, it's just a bunch of mercenary barbarians that now have citizenship, and nobody's got a job, and everybody's got to leave to go live on these latifundia because I got to get close to where the earth can produce me some food to survive. And then I guess whatever's left can be fought over by the remaining ruling elite. And Quigley goes on that usually vain efforts are made by legislation to stop the wastage. I think what I talked about with France trying to determine how many buttons can go on clothes is an excellent example of that. Religious, intellectual, social, and political levels begin to lose allegiance of the masses on a large scale. Do you think that describes Congress's approval rating?
Yes, Congress and the corporate media as well.
Yeah.
I think Congress ranks just a notch below cockroaches in U.S. opinion polls, approval polls.
Well, get your shoe. New religious membership sweeps over the society. I think, obviously, Christianity fits the bill for Roman civilization, and I think New Age fits the bill right now for this.
Absolutely.
And here's what I was saying before, and this is what I have italicized, which I think is the most important point. There's a growing reluctance to fight for society or even pay taxes to support it, because you no longer believe in the culture. You no longer believe in the concept of the society. And eventually, the civilization can no longer defend itself and will continue to get weaker until an invader comes along to smash it in stage 7, which is invasion. If everybody who's watching this now or recording could like, share, and subscribe it helps us out a lot.
Yeah.
I hate saying it, but it's just true.